everybody. I'm very pleased to have today's subcommittee hearing is going to be on the Roma. And we have with us from Montreal, Dafina Savic, who is the founder of Roman IPE, a Montreal-based not-for-profit organization that fights discrimination against Roma worldwide. And we're very pleased to have her as a witness today. We will give you about 10 minutes to do your opening remarks, and then we will open up the floor to questions. And as this is, I believe, the first time that the subcommittee has heard on this topic, we're very much looking forward to your testimony. So go ahead, Ms. Savic.
Thank you. Well, first and foremost, I want to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to present the far too often ignored human rights situation of Romani people across the world today, a people whose very existence remains threatened, a people whose human dignity is continuously denied today across the world, a people whose plight remains largely invisible, and which I will attempt to shed light on today through my presentation. In the Romani language, when greeting people, we say, Voia să la captume, which translates to, I greet you with goodwill. I'm really hopeful that my presence here today will give you the will to take action on the often invisible human rights situation of Roma, which remains today across the globe largely ignored. So 7 years ago, I founded a non-for-profit organization called Roman IPE, whose main mission is actually to defend the human dignity and human rights violations that Romani peoples face across the world. And the organization was in fact built on the principle of unity, and in doing so, our organization has in fact worked in collaboration with many groups of people with whom we share suffering, and has in fact built collaborations with many different groups who have been victims of genocide. In the spirit of standing in solidarity, but also in action with those groups, we also want to acknowledge our solidarity with people who have presented before this committee, namely indigenous peoples, people of Burundi and the Rohingya in Myanmar, with whom we stand in solidarity. Almost 75 years ago today, the remaining 2,998 Roma prisoners of the Gypsy family camp in Auschwitz-Birkenau were massively murdered by Nazis and their collaborators. According to the latest estimates, between at least 500,000 of Roma were killed by Nazis and their collaborators during the Second World War. Unfortunately, this history remains largely ignored, unknown, and untaught globally. Our organization has been fighting for the past 8 years now for the Canadian government to officially recognize the Romani genocide. On August 2nd of last year, the Canadian government, via Minister Phelan and Minister Rodriguez, has acknowledged the commitment of the government to in fact recognize the Romani genocide. Today, we are still waiting for an official act of parliament to be adopted so that recognition can officially be granted. And one of the reasons that the recognition of the Roma genocide is highly important is in fact because part of the reason that the human rights situation of Roma and the hatred and anti-racism against Roma remains today one of the most normalized forms of racism today is in fact because the history of the Romani people, their very existence, but specifically the history of Roma during the Second World War remains largely unknown and unrecognized. During the Second World War, the idea that Roma were criminals was in fact a rhetoric that was used by Nazis and their collaborators to justify the mass murder of at least 500,000, if not more, Romani peoples during the Second War. Across countries, across European countries today, we unfortunately see that rhetoric being repeated, whereas in many countries across Europe, physical walls have been built to separate Roma from non-Roma citizens. These are walls that are not at borders, but walls that are actually built within cities to separate Roma from non-Roma citizens. In countries like Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romani children are disproportionately placed in segregated schools without prior testing, based on the idea that Roma are mentally inferior than non-Roma. This segregation has been documented and condemned by many organizations such as Amnesty International, the European Roma Rights Center, and many other organizations who have spoken out and actually called on those countries to take concrete measures to end the segregation of Romani children in those respective countries. Yet, unfortunately, as reported recently by Amnesty International and many other organizations, the segregation of Roma, in fact, is still present in almost all those countries. As early as 2012, cases of forced sterilization of Romani women were also documented in countries like Hungary and Slovakia. Governments of those countries have actually acknowledged that this was the case, yet no measures were taken to actually offer compensation to the women who were forcefully sterilized in those countries. Just recently, in countries like Ukraine, in fact, last year, despite the many warnings of organizations like Amnesty International upon the violent attacks inflicted on Romani settlements in the Ukraine, a young Roma man was actually killed by far right on the basis of the idea that Roma need to be killed to eliminate the so-called gypsy crime. In Italy, the Minister of Interior, Matteo Salvini, recently announces his intention to create a Roma census, a policy which is very reminiscent of the 1933 policies inflicted upon the Jewish population in Italy at the time. This policy, in fact, gained a wide public support and in fact has led to an increase of hate crime against the Romani population in Italy. Just last year, after the violent killing of 3 young Romani girls, graffitis throughout Rome praising the death of those 3 girls were actually documented. In fact, some pictures show graffiti saying 3 less Roma. And this was just last year. This month, in fact, in Bulgaria, there has been neo-Nazi marches threatening Roma villages, chanting anti-Romani slogans, and encouraging anti-Romani violence. In France, a few months ago, as a result of a medieval stereotype where Roma were accused of stealing children, there has been many violent attacks which left many Roma families, including children, hospitalized. And this was simply on the spread of fake news via social media. And our colleagues in France are the only organization who has spoken out against this, and because of which action by the government has actually taken place. So there are many, many, many countries, and this was just passed this month. We're not talking about years ago. We are talking about a few weeks ago where Romani people were actually killed, including in Bulgaria as well, for the simple reason of being Roma. And I just want, if I may, to quote some of the quotes from the ruling parties in those countries prior in those marches. Whoever runs over a gypsy child is acting correctly if he gives no thought to stopping and steps hard on the accelerator. This is a quote from a political columnist and a founding member of Hungary's governing Fidesz party. Gypsies to the gas chambers. I'd set them all on fire, bury them alive, stab them in the back. These were quotes from ethnic Czechs during demonstration against Roma in the Czech Republic. So we have seen between 2012 and actually until today, what we call anti-Roma marches, where we have most of the time organized by the far right, but also widely supported by everyday citizens, where people march with swastika signs and often dressed up as Hitler, chanting anti-Romani slogans. So how did the world react to those situations? Unfortunately, it didn't. Because, as I mentioned before, one of the most normalized forms of racism today is actually hate violence committed against Roma. And it is, unfortunately, based on the belief that Roma are entrenched criminals. Now, how did the Canadian government react to this? Unfortunately, in 2012, under the previous government, so a lot of Roma were coming to Canada to seek asylum and seek protection from the rise of neo-Nazi movement. And this was just in 2012 where the far right reached its peak. And we actually had in a village in Hungary 6 Roma who were killed, including a 6-year-old boy, as a result of these attacks by the far right. So a large number of Roma came to Canada to seek asylum. The response of the government at the time was unfortunately to repeat that rhetoric of criminality, accusing Roma of being bogus refugees, undeserving of Canadian protection. So our organization has asked to work to address these issues with every single minister since Minister Jason Kenney, who was in fact responsible for the introduction of Bill C-31, under which specific measures were taken to restrict the entrance of Romani asylum seekers, whereby billboards were actually placed in the villages such as Hungary, where Roma were known to come from, discouraging Roma asylum seekers from applying to Canada. And the policy measures that were taken were proven to be efficient, as since the policies, according to the statistics, the decrease of Roma acceptance decreased from 90% between 1998 and 2012. And our organization has actually worked with many, many families who have been unjustly deported. And we are actually, in fact, still working with a family who's to face deportation in the next 2 weeks, because Bill C-31 is in fact still in place. And the countries which I've mentioned where Roma are perceived to be animals and who are threatened to be killed are considered safe by the Canadian government. And so one of the issues when the new government came into place regarding Bill 31, one of the provisions that was suggested to be made was that the criterias of what constitutes a safe country be revised, and that there would be a board of experts deciding on what criteria those countries were safe. Unfortunately, upon Minister Hussein's mandate, when he was taken up, that was dropped from the mandate of the minister. So those countries are still considered to be safe. So of course there is an increase of acceptance of Roma, especially from Hungary, in light of the well-documented evidence of persecution of Roma in those countries. Yet there are still consequences to that bill that we have seen from our organization's point of view, where we actually have in the past three months worked at least on 3 cases of deportation of Romani families who came around 2012. So there is still consequences to the policies enacted by the Canadian government. And of course, just to give you a bit of a background of the organization, when we started the organization, our intention was actually to use Canada as a model for Europe, despite Canada having its own human rights issues in terms of how Europe can do better. But unfortunately, the Canadian government led us to the opposite of that, because Roma who were coming from those countries were actually facing this discrimination they were facing in their countries, and sent back to situations of discrimination, and actually doubled the discrimination in the home countries. And I'll end on that because I think my time is up. But just to give you, I have 2 minutes. So just to give you a concrete example, according to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which the Canadian government has ratified, a country cannot send people back to situations where they will face persecution, whereas in the case of Roma, that is exactly what happened. And we work with many families, especially for Romani children, who knew that they were to be refused because of the high refusal rate of refugees whose education was not recognized in countries where they already face segregation, when were sent back to their countries and faced double discrimination and actually had to drop out of school. So I'll end on that note, but I just want to end on concrete recommendations, if I may, in 30 seconds. So essentially what we're asking the Canadian government is to eliminate Bill C-31, or at least to appoint a board of experts to determine what constitutes a safe countries, to work with European governments to address the ongoing human rights situation in those countries, and to officially adopt an act of parliament. And I have drafted the bill that is actually ready to be presented, simply needs to be presented by members of parliament so that the Romani genocide can be recognized. And I think the committee here's very mission is to prevent future atrocities from happening, and it really begins with recognition. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very informative testimony. And now we will go to some questions. We will start with Mr. Anderson for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate this, and thank you for being here today. I'm just wondering, can you give me the size of your community, and as far as the community, how many
In
people?
Canada?
No,
Sure.
no, I'm actually in Europe is where I'm interested. Canada,
Oh,
I think it's about 5,000 in Canada. Is that right?
No, actually, so one of the main issues with Roma is documentation and numbers and data, and part of the reason because there's no way to identify one's Roma identity other than self-identification. So according to the latest census in Canada, there's between 4,000 to 6,000 Roma, but in fact, according to Romani Civil Society organization, there's between 80,000 and 100,000 Roma who live in Canada, and if not more. And the reason that Roma are less likely to self-identify is obviously because most Roma who come to Canada are there to escape situations of discrimination and come with European passports most often, such as myself, I have a European passport. So there's no way to identify somebody who's Roma unless they identify. And in Europe, the latest estimates are between 10 to 15 million in Europe only. In the Americas, there's at least 2 million.
Okay, so if the main identification is self-identification, what definition would you use to define the Roma community then? Do you have a definition, or is it too broad to do that? We're speaking specifically about a community, but what are the identifying characteristics of that community in your mind?
Well, of course, from a human rights standpoint, we tend to avoid defining people, but I think what defines the Romani peoples is there is a common history, there's a common language, there's a common cultural heritage, but I mean, in terms of the history of Roma, is actually a history of discrimination and persecution. Is part of the reason that Roma are actually a global diaspora. So Roma came to Europe in the 12th century, originally from northern India, and are now spread across the world. So there's Roma populations in the Middle East and Australia and Latin Americas as well. So in terms of definition, there are common traits, and the common traits are in fact the common history and cultural heritage of Roma, but it's very difficult to restrict the group of people to a definition. There are many subgroups to Roma.
So I'd like to know what countries have been most effective in dealing with anti-Roma sentiment. Who's done a good job? Where would you point to?
Unfortunately, wherever there is a Roma population, there is discrimination. So I think it's not a question of which country has been more effective. It's unfortunately where Roma have been the most invisible. And Canada, in fact, the reason that Roma have been able to emancipate, because the first Roma who came to Canada came as early as the 1800s, so Roma have been here for at least 200 years, if not more, and their emancipation is due to their invisibility. And so I mentioned earlier in my address that when we started the organization, we wanted to use Canada as a model. And what I meant is that Canada, I guess for a lack of knowledge, didn't inflict any quote unquote inclusion policies. And that was the success because in fact, when they were simply granted equal rights, so equal access to education, equal, not special treatment, equal access. And so it became I don't like the word integration, but the emancipation of Roma became natural because they were granted equal rights. Whereas in Europe, there are many issues with the way that things are done in terms of addressing the human rights situation of Roma. One of them is the structural racism that exists within European organizations, whereas policies about Roma are done not by non-Roma, and Roma are excluded from policy processes that concern them. So they often what I call exclusionary inclusion policies because they are targeting the wrong problems. So we speak about, for example, integration without addressing the fact that Romani children are segregated in schools. So when talking about education, it's first important to address the problem at its root causes, which is often one, as I mentioned, of an entrenched mentality that Roma are inferior.
Can I just ask you about that then? Because I think the last thing we want is for our children to be discriminated against. Is it a general principle across Europe that Roma children are segregated, or is it some countries that do that? Where would you find that?
So there are more certain countries. So in Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, in Serbia, in Greece. So I would say that in Hungary and the Czech Republic are the cases where it's been more documented, and there's much more evidence in Romania as well. So in fact, you mentioned, just to go back to before, there's been a lot of money allocated to Roma inclusion. And in Romania, in fact, part of the funds were actually used to build a separate school for Roma.
So do they put the schools in the area where people are settled, and then
So they
draw the line around that? Is that
they put the school in a Roma settlement, but that was excluded, and no teachers wanted to teach there. In fact, so the money was actually used to build a segregated school, and there were no roads to access the school as well. And one of the issues is in fact that a lot of teachers refuse to teach in Roma settlements because of racism and prejudice.
So there's some issue around lacking documentation and being able to,
Yes.
access the bureaucracy. Can you just talk a little bit about that as well? What are
Sure.
the causes of that, and are there any good
Sure.
solutions to that?
Well, the root cause is often situations of racism. I mean, my grandfather had to change his last name in order to gain a Serbian passport because our last name was Shine, which is a very identifiable Romani name, and we had to change it to Savic, which is a very commonly known Serbian name, in order to gain access to a Serbian passport. And especially in Eastern Europe, and I was recently at the UN Minority Forum, which focused on statelessness, and the European Roma Rights Center actually just issued a report documenting the fact that there's a high proportion of Roma who are undocumented and stateless, and often one of the many issues I didn't have to address in my presentation is the fact that during conflict, Roma often face double discrimination, and the situation in former Yugoslavia is one which attests to that, where we have a high proportion of Roma who became stateless as a result of the war because they are not considered to be part of any of the countries who then separated. So essentially nobody really wanted them, so they were bounced back from country to country. And the fact that many Roma were illiterate, so in terms of access and documentation, to not be able to actually identify during birth is one of the issues why there's a lack of...
One more short question.
8 seconds.
8 seconds. Stateless and undocumented. I'm just wondering if you can tell me
Yes.
what impact has the massive migration into Europe caused to your community in the last 10 years then? Maybe somebody else wants to follow
Migration is the big one. Well, the thing is, I think when we're looking at the situation of Roma, we always have to address it from a historical perspective. And part of the discriminatory policies, for example, in Italy or in most countries, are a result of the fact that Roma are believed to be nomads, where 90% of Roma are actually sedentary. So if we see, for example, immigration policies are often built on the perception that Roma are nomads, and it's part of the Romani culture to travel, when most of the time they're fleeing situations of persecution. So in terms of migration, of course, because of the rise of the far right and the rise of the anti-Roma sentiment, there's been movements, and even when we talk about situation of conflict, Syria. So the Domari population of Syria, which is a subgroup closely related to the history of Roma, were actually doubly discriminated because they were refused from refugee camps. But yet this is reported by UNHCR, and their plight was not addressed. So in terms of migration, there's always a double. And actually, just to finish on that point, because I know my time is up, but the Hungarian government actually used Roma as an excuse to refuse refugees from Syria, because they're saying we have already a Roma to deal with, so we were not accepting more refugees. So there's like a double effect in terms of migration.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Fredriskatos for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Savic, for being here. Thank you for your work. Stateless minorities face a particularly difficult time in the international environment when it comes to raising their voice, and you spearheading advocacy here in Canada means a great deal. I wanted to ask you actually on that with my first question. Here in Canada, and you also mentioned that you're collaborating with others, I take it in Europe, perhaps the United States. Where does your advocacy tend to concentrate? Within national parliaments, United Nations, a combination? How do you do it?
Everywhere, quite frankly. And that is because, as I mentioned before, one of the main issue of Roma is invisibility both in terms of as a people. A lot of people in the Americas is that the very existence of Roma is being denied. I mean, myself, when I introduce myself and I say I'm Roma, people like that's not a thing. Or even the stereotypes associated with Gypsy, so the strong dehumanization of Roma, which is actually one of the steps of genocide, in terms of the strong belief that quote unquote being Gypsy is not a people, but it's a lifestyle, actually contributes to the dehumanization of Roma and makes it very difficult to address issues in the Americas because people actually have this notion, even within human rights circle, when we are presenting situations of Roma in human rights circles, it is often disregarded or saying, oh, but Roma, that's a little different. So that's one aspect. In terms of our advocacy work for the past 7 years, we've addressed it at every level. So both provincially, I mentioned federally, we have submitted a report on Bill C-31 since 2012 to every single minister. We've requested meetings, which unfortunately we haven't had yet, so we're still waiting. We are working very closely. I was a former UN Minority Fellow, so we are also working with the UN OHCR office based in Geneva, and we were part of the past 2 regional Roma in the Americas workshop, which we organized in the Americas, and we actually helped organize. We were just recently at Harvard University, and we facilitated the collaboration between the OHCR office and Harvard University to continue the recommendations that were made during the last Roma in the Americas regional workshop, which took place in Boston. And so we're working now with UN to see the upcoming session, which will be most likely in Mexico. We also work with a strong network of European-based organizations, who are working strongly with the Council of Europe. And so that initiative actually led to the official recognition of the Roma genocide by the European Parliament in 2015. And so we're working with them in terms of mostly recognition of the Roma genocide. And we've recently been approached by the European Network on Statelessness to become a member of the network, who are also addressing issues mainly of statelessness, mostly in Europe. So
you're busy. Is
a
your
little
point.
bit.
It sounds like it. Well, again, I commend you because it requires a lot of effort, to say the least. I've had the opportunity in the past, in a previous life, if I can put it that way, prior to going into politics. I worked as an academic and media commentator, and your experience parallels very closely what the Kurdish minority and what the Amazigh minority has done in terms of raising international attention and awareness about their cause. I wanted to ask you, though, something quite specific. Your organization, and you've touched on it here today a little bit, but I wonder if you could expand. What are the main goals? I mean, if you're going to leave this committee with a message on what you would like to see this government enact in terms of an approach to some of the issues that you have raised, what's 1 or 2 takeaways that we can, as a committee, keep in mind? And
so we have a few, but I'll keep it to 2. In terms of our objectives in Canada in relation to the situation of Europe, really what we have been focusing over the past 7 years is really our priority has been the recognition of the Romani genocide by the Canadian government, because as I mentioned, it is an essential step in preventing a genocide as we see it, especially today, because what we are asking in the bill that we drafted is a commitment to recognizing the Romani genocide, but also with that commitment committing to addressing the human rights situation of Roma, not only in Europe, but worldwide. Secondly, securing rights for Romani refugees has been a priority for us. So the elimination of Bill C-31, or at least the revision of what criteria are used to determine what constitutes or not of a safe country is definitely a priority. I think Canada, as the government, has the responsibility to speak out, at least would be a very first step, to just speak out about the very gross violations that Roma are facing. When Roma are being killed, the world is actually silent. So I think Canada could take a lead responsibility in this. And I just want to say that we are currently working with Global Affairs and Heritage Canada regarding the recognition. And so what we have asked Global Affairs is to address situations with embassies in those countries. So we have been in touch, for example, with the ambassador to Bulgaria regarding the killing of a Roma child that has been recent and the hate speech promoted by minister at the time. And we are now trying to address the situations in France, so the Canadian government could take a leadership role in at least facilitating dialogue between the embassies in those respective countries with strong Romani populations.
I'm happy that there is engagement that at least has begun. So thank you for that, because as a committee, I mean, you can come here with 40 priorities, but you won't have any priorities, and so you won't leave us with any priorities, rather. So you've left us with 2 things to consider and ponder. And I'm looking at Madam Chair. I think I have time for one more question. 1 minute. Okay, with the final question then. You talked about social media, and you
Yes.
talked about particular images and particular narratives that are circulating on social media, whether it's, and you didn't get into it, but I'm going to guess WhatsApp, Twitter perhaps, and we can think of other examples. But here in Canada, in fact, we've had a whole debate, and there was recently a committee of parliamentarians based in Canada and from various countries that convened and talked about what democracies can do to look at social media. And we continue to urge as MPs, and I know the government has said this as well, that social media organizations ought to recognize their responsibilities to combat false information, fake news, if you like the real fake news, not the fake news that some say exists, which is actually true. Can you go into that? Because
Sure.
you've talked about the Roma as being particular victimized within especially populist rhetorics these days that builds upon, historical narratives that have always targeted the Roma. But what, when you talk about advocacy, is your organization and others like it going and asking Facebook, Twitter, those that run WhatsApp, to get serious about policing the sort of activities that happen on their platforms?
So I guess there's 3 answers to your question. So the first being that I mentioned before that we work in strong collaborations with other groups who have been victims of genocide, and we were just recently last month in April in the context of Genocide Prevention and Awareness Month. We were here to actually ask the Canadian government to adopt a policy on prevention on online hate, because one of the main reasons actually that well, I mean, we all know that genocide begins with words, right? And one of the main trigger is actually the legitimization of hate speech, especially on social media. And you mentioned Twitter. I mentioned in France, what happened actually is purely a result of the promotion of fake news on Twitter actually led to attacks on Roma settlements, and most people were actually hospitalized simply because of the spread of a rumor where it's a really medieval age stereotype where Roma were believed to actually steal children. And based on the spread of that, there was actually hate against Roma that was promoted. So of course we are addressing it. I think the Americas and the issues, as I mentioned before, is that we actually have to fight for people to stop using the word gypsy as synonymous with nomad or free-spirited, so the level of dehumanization is very strong. In Europe, we have many, I see my time's up.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe you can elaborate on a further question, but we'll go to Ms. Hardcastle for 7 minutes.
Yeah, actually continue to elaborate on that, because I have to be honest with you. If we're going to educate people and be candid and be respectful of a Romani, I want to understand more about using terminology like gypsy and what we can do on social media. Go ahead.
Sure. So I'm not going to give you the historical background because it is quite long, but just so you have an understanding of why the terminology is derogatory. Of course, as in many situations, this is often debated, the use of the G word, and that's because the root of the word, so gypsy, comes from the Greek word atsiganos, which means untouchable. And this was actually a term that was imposed on Roma in their first arrival in Europe because they had darker skin and they were falsely believed to be Egyptians. So Egypt, gyp, and the term gyp actually became synonymous. So when you say you're being gypped, it's actually synonymous with theft. And so again, so the very identity of Roma is associated with theft or robbery. And we have actually American TV shows who are saying, like the show called Gypsy, which had nothing to do with Roma, but had to do with, I guess, misbehaving or theft or robbery. And so in terms of, there's actually a restaurant in Montreal who just opened who's called Gypsy. And we've contacted them and we said, well, this is derogatory. He said, well, we think it's free-spirited, so it's okay. So in terms of the level of understanding, what's important is that convincing people to use the right terminology is difficult. So we actually made a recommendation to the United Nations to adopt a resolution to officially condemn the use of the word for their purposes. Now, the challenge that comes with that is similarly to the use of the N-word, is that Roma themselves, some identify themselves with the term because it's been like that for centuries. So it's about reclaiming the term. So there's a lot of layers of complexity that lie with that. But I think concretely what can be done is definitely on social media. I think that, Facebook has been under a lot of scrutiny for especially, and we have seen, especially in the case of Myanmar, for example, the responsibility of social media in allowing hate speech. And I think definitely there are concrete things that can be done. I think the first thing is starting to condemn internationally and globally the use of such terminology when we see it. And so, of course, it is very difficult given the scope of the human rights violations of Roma to address terminology. But in the Americas, I would say that it's one of the root causes of the dehumanization of Roma and the perception of Roma as not being a group of people, but rather being a social behavior. And this is, in fact, one of the reasons that still continues to justify the human rights violation against Roma today.
Really interesting. I was just signaling because the members of Parliament who are from the Montreal area need to have this explained to them, I think, because even a best case scenario would be that the restaurant changes its name, but you understand a small business person's perspective. They've made a lot of investments in the name, but they can also use social media to talk about what they're embracing and what they're denouncing,
course,
right?
well,
they can do that. But that's so intriguing. I'm so glad that you spoke to us about that because there is a lot we can do. Now I just want to go back if I can. Madam Chair? 3 minutes. Okay. Can you tell us what should we be taking away this issue of the designated country of origin list, removing the countries, and then where should we be going with that moving forward, do you think, then?
Well, of course, our recommendations is to eliminate Bill C-31 as a practice. And of course, Bill C-31 did not only negatively impact Roma, but mostly because, in fact, all the safe country list constitutes of all the countries who are in the European Union, Mexico, and the United States. And most of the countries were actually arbitrarily placed on the list after the removal of visa that were imposed on Hungary and Romania. So it was actually, in fact, a direct result of the fear of Roma coming to Canada. And I think moving forward, I think definitely our recommendation is to eliminate Bill C-31, but if for whatever reason that's not possible, I think definitely we should reinstate the provision, which was actually part of the Ministers of Immigration's mandate, is to revise what criterias, based on what criterias it was decided that a country is safe or not. And I think definitely not only for Roma, but for minorities at large in most of these countries where we see a rise of the far right, we see a rise of anti-Semitism as well in those countries. And there's actually in those countries also a strong homophobic sentiment as well. Right. So I think we need to define what criteria, under what criteria a country is safe and for who it is safe.
Mm-hmm. I just need to clarify. So in May of this year, all the countries were removed from the list.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is, there's still impact about that because, since 2012, in terms of the Commission and the way the decisions are made, especially, I can only speak to the situations of Roma refugees because those are the cases that we worked on. But for example, I mentioned we have actually a deportation case we're working on now. And so we see the impacts of the bill on the perception that this had, that those countries were safe. And that's actually used in decisions to justify the lack of credibility of the claim because those countries are perceived to be safe.
Okay, thank you.
We will now go to Mr. Tabera for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here. Thank you for being an advocate for the Roma people. I know that on International Day, the Foreign Affairs Minister, International Roma Day, the Foreign Affairs Minister put out a statement on social media in solidarity, and said that that Canada stands against the hate and discrimination that is often faced by the Roma people. And I know that your organization has been sponsored to speak at many international organizations to speak about the plight of the Roma people. And I just want you to elaborate on how Canada has assisted and what Canada can do more to assist on the global stage.
Well, in terms of sponsored, we haven't been sponsored. Our organization has been running with actually $0 for the past 7 years. And so it's a completely volunteer organization. Part of the reason is because I know this has changed recently, but we are not registered as a charity, so we couldn't actually access funds because most of the work that we were doing was actually political advocacy. And I know that this has changed relatively recently. And so the only source of funding we have was actually from benefit concerts that we actually went to Roma to pay for the legal fees of Roma refugees. Now, that being said, in terms of the work you mentioned, the statement, that's actually, the statement came as a result of the work that we're doing with Global Affairs and Minister Phelan's office, and we actually requested that statement to be made in light of the commitment of recognition of the Romani genocide. So just to give you a background, so we have asked the Canadian government to recognize officially the Romani genocide and declare August 2nd as the official day of commemoration of the Romani genocide. And with that, we asked for a commitment to address the ongoing human rights violations of Roma across the world. And as part of that commitment, we're working with Global Affairs to see what can be done. So I can say that the situation in terms of human rights has been a much easier situation in terms of the government response to take steps. The recognition, however, has been very, 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 very difficult in terms of getting the government to adopt an official act of parliament to officially recognize the Romani genocide, because as it stands right now, it remains a statement where the government commits or recognizes that the Romani genocide, but there's no act of parliament officially recognizing it. So that's what we're working on now. And I think what the government can do more is speak out about these situations. So we haven't seen statements from the government when all these situations, and we do address it regularly with Global Affairs. Whenever there's a situation, we send an email and we raise awareness both with our own MPs in Montreal, but also at the federal level and at the international level as well. So I think those are the two concrete things that can be done.
Along with this committee, I also sit on the Citizenship and Immigration Committee, and there's in the recent years there's been a large influx of migrants fleeing to better prosperity in Europe. Within the last, I would say, given 20, 30 years, has the spike in discrimination and hate crimes towards the Roma people, has it increased over the years in Europe? And has this been a factor with other immigrants coming to the region, with Eastern Europe having strict immigration policies and kind of closing the doors on any new migrants? Has it increased the discrimination against the Roma people?
Yes, I mean, that's always a difficult question because I think it's a bit more documented in the past 20 years. So there's been actually more actions to try to document it. But definitely, according to the Harvard University latest report, there's actually been an increase in hate crimes against Roma in Italy between 2017 and 2018. And with the rise of the far right across Europe, there's been a strong anti-Roma sentiment that's been promoted, and a lot of these parties have actually gained power based on the basis of that anti-Roma rhetoric. And we've seen this in Hungary, for example. We've seen this in the Czech Republic. And there's been actually more instances of violence where we've seen anti-Roma marches across villages. So not only in Hungary, but in Czech Republic, in Bulgaria just recently, and even in France, there weren't marches, but they were attacks, and those were attacks carried by citizens. So I think the danger in terms of anti-Roma hate speech is that is unfortunately not limited to the far right, we see it at the center as well. So we have seen in France just recently, and we see it everywhere where there was a strong normalization of anti-Roma hate speech. So yes, definitely there's been documentation of the increase, and the CERD, actually the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, who just reviewed Hungary, actually expressed its deep concern over the rise of anti-Roma hatred and violence just in the last report.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Mr. Sweet for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Savage, in fact, since you're on that subject, the instance of hate against Roma in France has now eclipsed Hungary, hasn't it? It's gotten really bad. Is that correct?
It's hard to beat Hungary, but I mean, definitely in the past few weeks, we've seen, as I said, like there's been definitely a rise in the anti-Romani sentiment in the past, yes.
You said for the past 7 years. Is that how old your organization is, 7 years old?
Yes, well, we started the background work in 2012, but we officially registered in 2013, yes.
Okay. Have you had any resistance at the UN in regards to any of your efforts to have them address the statelessness of some of your community in Europe and the recognizing the size of your community?
The resistance met at the UN was not in regards to the issue of statelessness, was in regards to the recognition of the Romani genocide,
Okay.
where annually the January 27th declared the International Remembrance Day. So many Roma civil society organizations have actually asked for Roma to be invited as part of that ceremony. In the past 20 years, only 2 Roma have been invited. So the resistance has been more in terms of the recognition of the Romani genocide rather than statelessness. In fact, I mentioned the Minority Forum focused on statelessness last year, and there's actually been many statements made by civil society on statelessness. In terms of the size, actually the UN, I mean, we've also done a lot of work with many organizations to get the UN to actually speak more about the situations of more Roma in the Americas, because one of the challenges in Canada and the Americas at large is that human rights situation of Roma is very Eurocentric at the moment because of, for example, institutions such as the European Union. So the plight of Roma in the Americas or even in the Middle East, for example, is often in work because there is no international institution who are monitoring it. So we're working now with the UN to try to have more actions taking up on that.
I see there's also the one similarity between the Jewish anti-Semitism and the Roma hatred towards Roma is that there are these diabolical stories concocted in the Jewish case. It's the blood libel that's insidious and perpetuated by evil people. And I see there's stories of baby theft that is constantly concocted around Roma. Tell me about that and how that's disrupted communities and caused even police officials to actually investigate.
Sure. Well, actually, I mentioned very briefly the history of the Romani genocide, but in fact, so in 1936, the Nuremberg laws were actually modified to include Roma as part of the Nuremberg laws. And in terms of the racial purity rhetoric of the Nazis, there's actually specifically said that Roma were inferior and that were prone to crime. So as I mentioned, the idea of Roma criminality was actually used during the Second World War to justify the mass murder of Roma. And unfortunately, we still see it today. And often, I mean, we mentioned social media before. When we post often situations of segregation or forced sterilization, the response is often yes, but some Roma steal. So that I think it's very entrenched in people's minds that Roma are inheritedly criminals, and we see that at large in policy. And as I mentioned, the policies, for example, Matteo Salvini, the intention is to eliminate gypsy crime. In Hungary, the newest formed extreme right group has actually a manifesto. In its manifesto, it has a section called the Gypsy Question. And in the Gypsy Question, the intention is actually to eliminate gypsy crime. In Italy, they actually sent troops to Roma settlements to actually guard against the security threat of Roma. So we've seen that this rhetoric of Roma being criminals has actually been one of the main arguments used to justify the human rights violations of Roma today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now go to Ms. Hardcastle for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This is really interesting. So I guess just in continuation of that, then you talked a little bit about what some of these groups are doing and talking about the elimination of gypsy crime. What are some of the examples that you can give us of some of the examples of the structural racism that you talked about? And I know that would be in Europe, but how is that that ripple effect, and what is structural even here in Western countries, including Canada?
Well, just to build on that notion in terms of you mentioned the police. The police is often when there are situations like that, the police is called to intervene, but they're actually contributing to the violence, and this was actually documented in the Ukraine, and there's video evidence of that. So that rhetoric is often used for that. But as I said before, I mean, it's unfortunate, but the Canadian government itself used that rhetoric, saying that Roma are bogus refugees, that they're coming here to abuse of the social welfare system, and their claims were deemed to be unfounded. Whereas obviously the situation in Hungary and most of the countries where the Roma were coming from at the time was very documented, and this was actually followed by the killings of 6 Roma in Hungary. So that rhetoric is, as I mentioned, is not only limited to Europe, but it's really spread across, and even in Latin America, we see it as well, and in the Americas as well, and in the United States as well. So it's a very predominant rhetoric that we see, often to justify, often in terms of access, equal access to opportunities. Roma will not be able to, educated Roma will not be able to access jobs because there's a structural racism where people don't want to hire Roma. And there's been a concrete example in Italy, for example, where these local Roma women developed a food truck, and actually nobody wanted to eat there under presumptions that they were cooking rats or things like that. So this mentality is very entrenched. And in terms of the structural racism, as I mentioned, there's a high proportion of Roma across the world who are highly educated but are not able to access employment because often of racism, so they have to hide their Romani identity. Of course, some Roma who are not as visibly Roma, who have lighter skin, are able to do that, but also with last names, it's difficult to identify if one's Roma or not. And this has also been documented where Roma have sent the CVs, and when they are showing up to interviews, they're actually not given the jobs because they're obviously Roma. And in terms of I mentioned in terms of political participation, despite the strong population in most of those countries, Roma are actually the main minority. There's very few Roma that are part of political processes, that are elected officials. And in terms of Roma inclusion policies, they're often not done in consultation with Roma. They're often done by non-Roma. And some of the European Union's policy were, for example, come volunteer to teach Roma hygiene, which obviously are itself problematic in addressing the human rights situation of Roma.
And how problematic is it when you think of the goal of your organization and the goal of achieving recognition of not just the genocide, but of human rights and recognition for the Romani? Because you had mentioned that your family had changed its name. How common is that? And do you see that in the future as being a problem or something we're going to have to make more well known? If we think there's, let's say, I'm being hypothetical now, but if we think this has affected 200 people when in fact it's affected 200,000 in a community.
I mean, again, like there's always layers of complexity when talking about Roma, and I think part of the reasons is because of the centuries of persecution has left unaddressed. And so, I mean, beyond the history of the Romani genocide, since their very existence, there's been, like during the Spanish Inquisition, Roma's tongues was being cut if they were speaking Romani. So that's why many groups of Roma, like the language is actually very endangered, and quite frankly, quite lost. And many of the Roma who have been able to emancipate and access jobs or higher education are because they have, in a sense, given up on the Roma identity. So that's why they were actually able to access the space. And my grandfather is an example because he was a tall white man with blue eyes, so visibly not Roma, and that's why he was actually able to change his last name. But that's the situation of many, many, many Roma. I mean, only in my family, there's many who, in order to access passports, had to do that. And in terms of recognition of the history, as I mentioned, for Roma, the issue is that there needs to be recognition of our existence as a people. And so in Romania, Roma were slaves for 500 years. And there's obviously, there's repercussions on the socioeconomic situations of Roma. And I think there's a strong parallel that can be made with the African-American history. And we see that because there are this history is actually reflective of the socioeconomic situation of Roma, where we see that Roma have been very passive, despite the fact that there's been violence, persecution, slavery, forced labor camps even before the Second World War. Roma have actually not been violent. The response of Roma has never been one of violence. It has been a passive one. That's why there's Roma spread across the world, because there's been a forced nomadism, because Roma left the country until they found equality, but they have never been able to found that equality, because wherever Roma went, they face persecution. So it's about recognition of history, but also of contribution of Roma that have made since the 12th century in European countries, but in Americas as well.
Thank you. And just for 2 minutes, we have the chair of our parent committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Levitt. If you just a very short question.
Sure, I've had the pleasure of actually speaking with Ms. Savage on previous occasions, and I last ran into you coming out of a press conference, and I want to actually ask you about that, because it was Genocide Prevention Month, I believe, was the occasion, and it was a coming together of civil society groups from the Ukrainian, Armenian, Rwandan, obviously the Roma, the Jewish, and other communities that have faced persecution over the years. And I'm just wondering if you can briefly give us a little bit of background on the support that exists in civil society and through those kind of organizations, and how that's a real advantage for the Roma community here that probably doesn't exist anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I think, I've also strongly collaborated with the Montreal Holocaust Museum, especially in terms of the recognition of the Roma genocide. And you mentioned the shared history of the Jewish population and that of Roma. And there's actually been, with CIJA, who has created kind of a coalition of different organizations who have been victim groups of genocide. So with that to the list, there's also the Yazidi of Iraq. And the press conference was aimed to actually ask 3 concrete things from the Canadian government in light of genocide awareness and prevention, and one of them being adopting a policy to addressing online hate, trying to welcome those people who are currently facing situations of mass atrocity and genocide, so namely, for example, Burundi, and the third one was officially adopting an act of parliament to recognize the Roma genocide.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your advocacy and for your very, very knowledgeable testimony today. I am going to actually go in camera for 1 minute. We just have a very quick committee business to take care of. So I would ask when I suspend that everybody who isn't supposed to be in the room, please depart from the room, and the members and staff please remain for just a minute. Suspend.
you.